I want to tell you a story and talk a little bit about assessing deficiencies when it comes to internal audits. When we find a control deficiency, too many people just say, well, this is an issue, this is a risk, but risk is the effect on objectives. So when we talk about it being a high risk, what does that actually mean? How does that actually affect what management is going to do in terms of daily execution, daily decision making, and actually achieving their strategies and objectives? I think too many auditors, they just say, well, this is a risk, and therefore we need to identify it as such and let management figure out what to do about it. Maybe we can make some recommendations as to what to do about it, but we're not necessarily helping them understand what this really means in the grand scheme of things. This is one of the reasons I really don't like the idea of rating deficiencies as high, medium, or low, because I don't think that's what we call actionable information. I came across that term when I was doing a series of meetings of the National Association of Corporate Directors. And the theme of the series of meetings was understanding and addressing the risk of cyber and hacking and disruption of our business, maybe even theft of intellectual and other assets. And what the directors universally said is, give us actionable information, information that we can use to make sure that the correct action is being taken. And I suggest to you that saying that the deficiency means that the risk is high doesn't necessarily mean anything. So let me tell you this story. This was soon after I became the head of internal audit, the vice president of internal audit, at a global company called Selectron. Selectron was the largest manufacturer of electronics on behalf of companies like Apple or IBM, what we called a contract manufacturer of electronics equipment. And I was taking over from a vice president who had done a good job, I think, but was now being recognized and moved into the corporate finance role as assistant controller. One of the things he had done was make sure that the executive summary, the very first page of an audit report, told a story. And this one really did. This particular story, this particular audit, because as I was going through and getting oriented, he was still there transitioning, and he was transitioning out and I was transitioning in. And he asked me to review this draft audit report for the audit that the Singapore team had done of our facility in Shenzhen, China. Shenzhen, which is in the southwest corner portion of China, not that far from Hong Kong. You actually take a ferry from Hong Kong over to the Shenzhen facility. And when I looked at it, it had the first part of the very first page was a table. And on that table, each of the rows was an area of risk: finance, inventory management, information security, compliance, and so on. There were about 7 or 8 different areas of scope that had been addressed. And the column right after that was a traffic light signal as to the achievement of objectives, the effectiveness of controls relating to each of those 7 or 8 different areas of scope. And every single one of those was red. Every single one. The next column was the number of significant deficiencies in internal control for that area. And then the last one was the number of other deficiencies. Deficiencies in internal control that they wanted to report, but they didn't rise to whatever's considered major or significant. This was all printed on glossy paper. For some reason, which I still don't understand, the department printed everything on glossy paper. So when I picked this up, I was dazzled, almost blinded by all this red on the glossy paper, flashing in my eyes. Okay, then I looked below the table, and there was, as there should be, a very succinct conclusion, an opinion statement, that in the opinion of the audit team, the controls were not effective. Okay, all right. Not a good situation for management to be in, that the audit is going to identify serious deficiencies and high-risk areas for everything that was included in scope. I called up Audrey. Audrey Lee was the director for internal audit in Asia Pacific Japan, based in Singapore. And she was going to be my number two within the internal audit department. I had staff in the United States, nobody at that time in Europe, and then she led the team for Asia Pacific Japan that was all based in Singapore at that time. Later we added people outside to improve the breadth of coverage that we had. And I called her up and I said, Audrey, we got to know each other a little bit, as you can only do it in a short period of time on a phone call. I said, Audrey, what does this audit report mean? And she looked at me. I could feel her looking at me, although we were only talking by phone. And she said, I don't understand. The controls are not adequate. There are serious issues. I said, Audrey, what does that mean? And she said, the controls are not adequate. The risks are high. What are you trying to ask me, Norman? So I said, okay, consider this. I understand you're on the 4th floor of the office building that the corporation has in Singapore. Yeah, good. So you get on the elevator, and inside the elevator you see Chester. Chester Lin is the CEO and president of Asia Pacific Japan for the company, for Selectron. And he greets you and says, Audrey, I understand you just finished an audit of Shenzhen. What do I need to know? And you have until that elevator gets down to the ground floor and he goes to the exit, to the doorway out, to tell him what he needs to know. So what I'd like you to do, Audrey, is call me back at the same time tomorrow, recognizing there was at that point a 15-hour time difference. And I want you to tell me what you would tell him. And I left it at that. The next morning she called me back and said, Norman, I think I've got it. I think I understand what you're getting at now. I will tell Chester that the controls and the management of risk in Shenzhen will not support the planned strategic move of operations from Singapore to Shenzhen, so that you can then adjust operations and make Singapore more of a new product facility, because Shenzhen has the additional capacity. And that will allow some other movements within China and Indonesia, Malaysia, to take effect. So the controls in Shenzhen won't support that added production and responsibility in Shenzhen. And I said, Audrey, you've got it. I really think you've got it. Thinking of My Fair Lady. I think you've got it, Audrey. This is what we need to do. We need to tell them what they need to know. And what they need to know is not just the risk is high, but what does that mean to me in terms of the decisions I'm making, in terms of the objectives I'm trying to achieve. And this is what you've just given me. You've given me actionable information. So when an internal audit identifies issues, we really need to think about what does that mean in terms of running the business? Not just saying that the risk is high, medium, moderate, whatever. But what does this mean in terms of running the business? Do we need to change strategies? Do we need to change organization or systems because of the risk? Is this a risk that we really should be taking? Because sometimes you need to take the risk, you need to accept the risk because it's the right thing to do for the business. Maybe the value of taking that risk justifies taking it. Maybe the reward is high. So I think what I'm suggesting is that rather than traffic lights or high, medium, low ratings, when you find an issue, think about what does this really mean to the business and how it's operating and the objectives it's trying to achieve. How can I communicate that? Well, first of all, I would suggest sitting down and having a constructive, open dialogue with management, operating management, and then with senior management, and talk about the issue and especially listen. Listen to them. Talk about, once you've agreed upon the facts, what this actually means, what its implications are for the business, and what is worth changing, what is worth doing, whether this risk is something as significant as you think it is or not. Maybe it's more significant, and maybe they've got better ideas as to how to address it. As I tell my people, never go to talk to somebody, go to listen. And auditors don't nearly spend enough time listening and making themselves open. When we find an issue in an audit, we should be ready to talk about it and with an open mind and consider how will this affect running the business. And we need to get to the point where we are helping management understand whether the risks are being addressed properly by the controls so that they can achieve their objectives. And when we find an issue, we need to be sitting down with them and say, okay, now what objectives are going to be affected? What decisions might need to be changed, if any? And let's communicate that. Tell people what this situation means to the business. Agree upon appropriate actions and communicate that. Don't just say the risk is high. That is not actionable information. Tell them what they need to know, when they need to know, so they can run the business better. So that is my story for today. I hope you enjoy it. It's somewhat controversial, I know, because everybody likes to rate risks high, medium, low, but I'm telling you that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't necessarily change what management is going to do in terms of running the business. And if it doesn't necessarily change anything they need to do, maybe it's not nearly as significant as you think it is. You have a great day, and if you like this and the other videos, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks.